started. Our schedule is offset for reasons I'm not sure why, but we are. But I thought we'd even go ahead. I think we're all here. We have Dr. Eric Yang, who is going to present to you today. He is a candidate for chair. His background is as follows. He was actually born in Seattle, went to undergraduate in medical school in Madison, Wisconsin, did his residency at Johns Hopkins, moved then from Hopkins to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where he did cardiology and then interventional cardiology. After that, he went to Chapel Hill, where he was for several years as program director in part of the cardiology fellowship and director of the cath lab. Do I have that right?
I was the ICU director there, yeah.
And now the last couple of years he's been in Phoenix, where he's working in a Mayo Clinic affiliate. And he's going to talk to us today about our future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about what I think the future of academic medicine is or will be. I must admit, this was a difficult talk to put together. Usually I'm able to put a talk together quite quickly because I'm usually asked to talk about a cardiology topic, and as you all know, in cardiology there's a plethora of clinical trials, and so usually I'm asked to talk about a specific topic. I pick a couple of clinical trials that I think help discuss that topic, put together some nice data slides, throw in some quotations and some jokes, and I have a talk. But this is different. There aren't a lot of data slides, and this talk is more like a TED Talk. I don't know if any of you all listen to NPR, but TED Talks are important. They talk about concepts. So they have a few data slides, but the most important thing is they're talking about key concepts. So I'm going to talk about some key concepts today. I have no disclosures that are pertinent to this talk. And so, part of it when I was a house staff like you guys, I was brainwashed. And part of the brainwashing was that every talk had to start with a quotation from a deceased prominent physician, particularly this guy. But today, since I'm doing something different, instead of starting with a quotation, I'm going to start with a painting. And so this is a painting that I used to see at Johns Hopkins Hospital. When you walked in, this is the first picture you saw. And before all the electronic journals, we used to actually have to go to the library to pull journal articles. So I used to see this picture quite often, but I never thought much about it. But last week when I was putting this talk together, I thought a lot about this picture, and so this is going to be a recurrent theme. I'm going to be showing this over and over again, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce this picture today. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of things this afternoon, and some of these titles may not make sense, but hopefully they will after I go through them. I'm going to talk about mission and focus. I'm going to talk about genotype and phenotype, which I think are very important. I'm going to talk about medicine and surgery versus the road to success. And once again, it'll be more clear after I discuss that. Then I'm going to end with a controversial topic, and it's going to be the Department of Surgery and the Department of Medicine with question marks at the end of it. And hopefully we'll tie this together with some philosophical thoughts. And so at any time, if there are any issues or concerns, just feel free to stop me and we'll address them. And so let's talk a little bit about this painting. So this is a painting I used to see all the time, and it was entitled The Four Founding Physicians. And so these are the original physicians at Johns Hopkins. Welch, who was the dean at the time and a pathologist. Halstead, who was the chief of surgery. Osler, the chief of medicine. And Kelly, the only person who was not a William, was the head of gynecology. And so in the early 1900s, this was a pivotal group. And so Welch, who was a pathologist and dean of the medical school, his mission was he wanted to improve the overall education of medical education in the United States. So not just at Hopkins, but all medical schools in the United States. And he formed a consortium of academics. I put nationwide in quotation marks because they're all East Coast, but at the time that's what they viewed the world as, was just the East Coast. And it was called the Hopkins Circle, and the goal was to improve medical education in the United States. One of its members was not a physician, but a gentleman named Flexner, who a lot of you all know is famous for his Flexner report. So his background was he wasn't a physician. He was actually a school teacher. He had received his undergraduate degree at Hopkins, but taught in Louisville. He had an interest in medical education and spent some time in Europe looking at education there and comparing it to education in the United States. And his work sort of caught the attention of a gentleman named Henry Pritchett, who at the time was the head of the Carnegie Foundation. So he asked Flexner to write a report on what he thought the state of medical education was in the United States. And this is the famous or infamous Flexner report, which was published in 1910. So this is a very controversial report, and by today's standards had a lot of comments that would be considered racist, but that's not what it's known for. What it's known for is changing the education of medicine in the United States. And what he recommended was that there were too many medical schools in the United States and that the number had to be decreased and the quality needed to be brought up. But specifically, medical schools needed to focus on science and research. And part of that was they had to have professors who were to be, quote, freed from patient care. So basically their only duties were research and teaching. And this focus on science and research and being freed from patient care had a high impact on the model of medicine that existed both in the 20th and 21st century. Now, Osler at the time was the chair of medicine, did not agree with the Flexner report. And so his colleague or his mentee was Harvey Cushing, which later would become one of the most famous neurosurgeons in the United States. But they didn't believe that. They thought that the mission of the Department of Medicine was twofold. And that was to educate nursing students, as well as physicians and medical students. That along with advancing the practice of medicine, which at the time they defined as studying and understanding disease states. And then developing a treatment strategy for those disease states. So their view of what the Department of Medicine should focus on was very simple. There's teaching, there was patient care, and at the center was patients. You needed patients to further the practice of medicine, right? Because that's where they study to learn disease states. You needed patients to educate your students, and you needed patients to be involved with patient care to maintain the hospital. And so their mission and their focus was pretty straightforward. But let's fast forward. So 1995 was when I started medical school, and as Dr. Stewart said, I went to the University of Wisconsin. And at the time, you know, the mission had changed a little bit. So when we went on rounds, we were a large group, right? Because it wasn't just nurses, nursing students, or medical students and trainees. We also educated physician assistants, pharmacists, physical therapists, and social work. But the main goal was still education, just the group got larger. But in terms of the research part, the focus wasn't the practice of medicine, but the science of medicine. And that included basic science, translational research, and clinical trials. And so if you drew the diagram here, things were different. At the center was obtaining funding and researchers. So this was important, right? So getting NIH funding was what brought prestige to the institution. It brought researchers who would bring in further grants to the institution. This notoriety brought patients. You know, patients wanted to go to the University of Wisconsin because of what it was known for research. Medical students like myself wanted to go there because it was a well-funded institution. And then these said researchers were also used to provide patient care and teach the medical students. And that was their model. And it focused on obtaining research funding and researchers. But there was also a transition going on at the time. And once again, not to single out these institutions, these are just examples of places that I've known that have changed, right? It used to be academic medicine was academic medicine, and private practice was private practice. But during this time, you started seeing a transition. A lot of hospitals, because of financial instability, were being bought out by private entities. So in 1996, the University of Minnesota, the hospitals were bought out by Fairview, which is a large private hospital chain in the Minneapolis Twin Cities. And that happened with the University of Oklahoma, which was purchased by one of the corporations here, HCA, which is a Tennessee corporation. And more recently in Arizona, the University of Arizona was merged or bought out by Banner, which is a large hospital system, which bought out not only the hospitals, but also their physician practice group. And you can see even in the lay media, this is from the Wall Street Journal, quote unquote, once cash cows, university hospitals, now a source of worry for schools. This is from New England Journal of Medicine, quoting a, quote, uncertain future for academic health centers, right? So the landscape is or was changing at this time. And the question is why? So there have been a lot of reasons, and one of it is this. So this is NIH funding, and you can see here the actual dollars, but the actual inflation-adjusted dollars, you can see a significant decrease in the amount of actual dollars for NIH funding. More importantly, if you're a researcher, you can see here the success rates for funding. So when I came out of training right about here, I was applying for some grants here, but now it's at 18%. Right, so they become very competitive to compete for NIH funding, so the total dollars have decreased and the actual people getting funded have decreased as a consequence. The issue is this, though, you can't say that this is the only reason why these hospital systems have not succeeded, right? Because if you look at this, and these are data from PricewaterhouseCoopers, the majority of academic institutions, including departments of medicine, the majority of their revenue does not come from grants. It still comes from clinical practice. And so a financial decrease in financial success for most academic institutions still comes in this realm from decreased clinical revenue. And so the question is, why would you have decrease in clinical revenue? Well, this is a complicated question here. And one is that the cost of care at an academic institution is higher than it is at an institution that's not an academic center. So this is data from New York hospitals. I figured this was the safest to show. You can see here Lenox Hill, NYU, Beth Israel, St. Luke's, so the teaching hospitals. This is the cost to work up an average person with chest discomfort at their institution compared to some of the private hospitals here. And you can see the costs are just highly significantly greater, you know, $5,000 to $6,000 versus $15,000 to $20,000. And so the cost of care at an academic institution is higher. And the question is, are patients willing to pay more for this, right? So in economics, there's a term called elastic or inelastic products. And so to sort of explain this to you, so how many of you all have an iPhone, right? How many of you all have the latest version, what is it up to now? I don't even know what it's up to, 7, right? How many have the version underneath it? Right, and then so the iPhones, with each iteration, there's just a slight change, but the prices keep going up. But despite the higher prices, people will still buy the product, right? Because you have to have your iPhone, right? So the question is medical care like this, and so they actually went out and polled a bunch of people, and they said, okay, hey, look, the quality of care in an academic center is better. So under that assumption, would you be willing to pay more for better care? 80%, no, we're unsure. And then of the 22% who were willing to pay more, how much more are you willing to pay? Up to 10% more, 20% more, 30% more, or more than 30%. So you can see here, the majority of people don't want to pay more, and if they do, they only want to pay very little. And so you can't say because you're an academic institution, you provide quote-unquote better care, that you're going to charge more and the patients will come. That's not a reasonable argument these days. And so now you have an academic department of medicine who's in a precarious situation. They have higher costs. They have decreased NIH funding. They usually take care of sicker patients who may not be as well insured. There's increased competition from community hospitals, right? They provide excellent quality care, in some cases better quality care, and in a lot of cases they do the same procedures that you can do in an academic institution, right? Those are your former residents and fellows there. Right? They can do everything that you can. And so there's also increased competition for patients, right? They're in a very precarious position. So based on this, what should be the mission and focus of the future Department of Medicine? Well, I think education will always be here, but I think an important part will be also the continuing education of all these above groups, right? So in the past, we focused just on teaching residents, just on teaching medical students and fellows, and when they're gone, they're gone. But as many of you all have been reading about, the American Board of Internal Medicine has been through some turmoil over the past year or so on how to maintain certification for physicians. And I think part of the model in the future will be more continuous education provided by local academic institutions. And so I think that'll be an important part, including the education of mid-level providers too. Advancing the science of medicine, but as well as the practice of medicine, because I think we need to be the forefront of improving the quality of care and having excellent outcomes, along with the basic science goals and the translational science goals. But more importantly, I think there's a third responsibility now, or mission focus for medical schools, and that's social responsibility. We have to make sure there's an adequate number trained of providers, right, whether that's nurse practitioners, PAs, or physicians, that are able to take care of the community that the institution is located in, right? We have to make sure that those numbers are robust and that those numbers are maintained, right? It's an issue that was not present 20-some years ago when I was going through medical school. But more importantly, I think what's changed or will need to change is this focus here. And so notice what I put in the center. Like if I would have showed this slide at an academic institution 20 years ago, I think they would have asked me to leave the stage, right? Because no one wanted to talk about this, right? But this is important. You have to have a financially viable department of medicine in order to accomplish all your missions. And in order to do that, you have to be able to obtain and maintain patients, whether that's in your specialist, subspecialist, or primary care groups. You got to be able to maintain patients, right? Patients are key. You have no patients, you can't teach. You have no patients, you can't do research. And you have no patients, you can't meet the needs of society. And I also think you need to provide high quality care. So you can't just take care of patients. You have to provide high quality that's cost effective, right? That's the key component these days. Good care at a reasonable cost. And then you have to be able to attain contracts with third-party payers, right? And I think that needs to be the focus of the future of a Department of Medicine. And by doing so, if you believe this model, you have sources of revenue that can be then used to contribute to your mission, right? So you have your sources and your uses, right? And this allows you to be able to accomplish your mission, right? If you don't have a financially viable institution, you can't do the things you want to do: education, research, patient care, and provide social responsibility to your community. And so that's why I think this model will be key for the future, okay? All right, so now that we discussed a little bit what I think the institution should be, let's talk a little bit about who should be working in the institution, and that's what genotype and phenotype are. And so I'm not talking about the genetic definition of these terms. I'm talking about what people look like when they apply for a job. So when I interview residents or interview fellows, or we look at potential faculty members, I look at their genotype and their phenotype. So their genotype is what they are on paper, although everyone looks similar on paper. More important is phenotype, and that's how they actually work in the workplace. And so there's a lot of phenotypes, and by all means, this is just a few examples here, right? And so when you become a faculty member, they like to sort of pigeonhole you into one of these categories, right? So there's the training program director that spends a lot of time with education, some clinical and some research. There's the clinician educator who spends a lot of time clinically taking care of patients, and part of that is also educating and has some research responsibility. There's the clinician investigator who spends a lot of time on research but also sees some patients, but the majority of his or her time is spent in the research realm. And then there are the division and department chairs, which are a combination of one of these two groups here with the administration component added to there, okay? And so the question is, how has this changed over time? And so here's our four friends again. And so it's sort of interesting what the genotype and phenotype of these guys were. So Osler, who's one of the most famous internists, doesn't have a college degree. He went to 1 year of college. And then he went to, which was common at the time, he went to medical school and then did 2 years of training in Europe and came on in a faculty position. Halstead actually had a college degree. He graduated from Yale. He had a 4-year degree, or actually, I think it was 5 years degree there. Then he went to Europe for 3 years, came back, and became a practicing physician. They were both generalists, meaning Halstead was a general surgeon, Osler was a general internist, and that was their genotype. Their phenotype was simple. this was this. They were clinician educators. That's what they did. And even though they had administrative responsibilities as department chiefs, they spent the majority of their time as clinician educators. That's what they did, and that's what they were. And that fit their model, right? That was their focus, right? They're clinician educators. So the question is, how did this change? So once again, here's my slide from 1995. And remember here, the focus was on obtaining NIH funding and researchers. So the genotype was a little bit different, right? First of all, everyone who went to medical school at that time had a college degree, most of them in some type of basic science. A lot of them had additional degrees, MD, PhDs. That was very common at the time. And the majority of them were subspecialists. They're, infectious disease, cardiologists, endocrinologists with NIH funding. And that was their genotype and phenotype. And the ones who became division or department chairs were basically clinician educators who took a little time out of their research allotment and did administrative responsibilities. But this was the makeup of the Department of Medicine in the 1990s, with the focus on the clinician educators. Clinician investigators. The clinician educators were important, right? Those are the ones who maintained the revenue for the department. But the main focus was on the clinician investigators. And so the question is, what is the future going to be? If the model of the future is maintaining a financially viable department, and that includes obtaining and maintaining patients, will the genotype and phenotype of the future faculty members change? And I think the answer is yes. First of all, I think from the genotype point of view, a lot of them won't be MDs. And I don't know what the usage of mid-levels are here, but the uses of nurse practitioners is going to be large, as well as physicians and assistants in the future, and they will be part of the Department of Medicine or the Department of Surgery, right? Their roles are going to be important. So some of the genotype of the members of the division or department won't even be physicians. Second of all, I think the focus back on the primary care provider, whether it be the general internist or the general pediatrician, will also be important because, once again, part of the model is obtaining and maintaining patients. And so in 1995, the focus was on hiring, cardiologists, gastroenterologists. But I think if you look in the future, part of the focus may be on general internists. You can argue maybe the department chair should be a general internist. And I think that's a fair argument. In terms of degrees, I think you're going to see additional degrees. I call them the M&Ms. And so MD, MBA, MD, MHA, MD, MPH, because remember, part of this responsibility in terms of administration will be part finance and public health. And I think having a better understanding of that will be part of the genotype of the future department and division chairs. And so once again, here's our table again. I think the focus will go back to the clinician educator, right? This is revenue generating. These are the teachers. These will maintain the viability of the division or department. The clinician investigators will always be important, right? That's the distinguishing factor of an academic institution, right? The clinician investigators, they will always have an important role and always will be an important aspect. But I think your division or department chair phenotype will change, right? Instead of the former clinician investigator who became the administrator, I think a lot of the future division department chairs will be the people who came out through here, the clinician educators, who have some additional training in administration will be the future division or department chairs, based on what I believe the mission and focus of the future will be. Okay, so now that we talked about the department, what it should be doing, and who the faculty members, let's talk a little bit about who the residents and medical students will be. And I want to tell you a story, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, but this was the 4 founding fathers, right? So you have a pathologist, a surgeon, an internist, and a gynecologist. But those of you, who recently went through medical school know there's a lot more choices to choose from when you're a 3rd and 4th year medical student to decide what you're going to go into. And so this was about, I don't know, maybe six years ago. I was on an inpatient rotation, and afterwards I did the debrief with the medical student, and she was a fantastic medical student, probably one of the best medical students I've ever had. And she was just phenomenal. She had great knowledge. She functioned like an intern, and she just had a great attitude. And so I asked her what was she interested in, and she was shy. She wouldn't give me any answer. And I said, hey, look, I already submitted your grade. You can be honest with me. What are you interested in? And she said, well, I'm interested in the road to success. How many of you all have heard about the road to success? So I never heard this before. I'm like, well, tell me about the road to success. And she said, R, radiology, O, ophthalmology, A, anesthesia. So everyone's smiling. So everyone's heard of this in some iteration. D, dermatology. And I'm like, this is fantastic. I've never heard of this before. This is great. I'm like, well, you know, this is phenomenal. I love this road to success. And I'm like, hey, you know, what about medicine or surgery? She looked me in the eye, literally looked me in the eye and said, Dr. Yang, I have good grades. Why would I go into medicine or surgery? No, she literally, without even a blink. And so to me, that was a, I don't know, for lack of better terms, a disturbing comment. And so later that afternoon, I was out running, and for you know, 8 to 10 miles, all I could think about was this conversation over and over again in my head. Right, and so the things I asked, you know, is it true that if you're, quote, smart, you don't go into medicine or surgery? And I'm like, is there any AOA data? So, you know, I graduated medical school in 1999. And so at my medical school, AOA was easy. They took the top 10% of students, so the top 16 students, and we got grades. And so it was easy to tell, and then you were made AOA. So in my class of 16 AOA members, 12 went into either medicine or surgery, and the other 4 went into what I consider a surgical subspecialty, ENT, orthopedics, and OB-GYN. But no one in the 16 went into the quote-unquote road of success, right? So in my mind, it wasn't consistent with the data I had in my head. But more importantly, you know, because it's harder to define what smart is, right? Grades and all that, that doesn't determine what a good physician is. But what I more importantly was worried about is it true that medical students in general just don't want to do medicine or surgery? I mean, and if so, why? And so now, every time I'm on the wards and I get a medical student, I bring them aside and I ask them, what are you interested in, what are you not interested in, and why or why not? So I've been doing this for the past 6 years. And so these are some of my observations, right? So once again, this is not hard data. And so, first of all, is it true that students don't want to go into medicine or surgery, right? So I had to go look for some data, and these are the data from 2016. So this is from the 2016 match, so the most recent one. And this is a little complex. And so what it is the number of applicants, U.S. applicants versus non-U.S. applicants from allopathic schools to the number of available slots. So in some specialties, the number goes above 1 because that means more people apply than there are slots. But here are the data. So here's internal medicine. The number of U.S. allopathic grads to the total number of slots available was 0.48, right? And that's almost as low as family medicine and pathology, okay? Now, you can argue, well, first of all, this is relative, not absolute data, because there's so many internal medicine slots that by absolute numbers, there's still a lot of U.S. grads going into internal medicine, and that's a legitimate argument, but these are still the data relatively. So, you know, it's on the lower end of the spectrum if you compare it to the rest of these specialties. So we have, let's find general surgery, 0.87, so that's good. Dermatology, 1.06. ENT, 1.01. So why is internal medicine down here? And so, like I said, I've asked every medical student that's rotated through me since then, and I've asked them this question. And you know, part of it is financial. And so this slide is, this is an awful slide. And I want to tell you why I think this is an awful slide. So, you know, my story is sort of unique. It's like we each have our own story to tell. But, you know, I went to college in 1991. I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I was a state resident at the time. And between scholarships, me working, and my parents paying for the difference, I was able to graduate college with 0 debt, right? Which is I think a great feat. But more importantly, when I went to medical school, so I went to the University of Wisconsin, and in 1995, the tuition and fees for a state resident for 1 year of medical school was $17,000 a year, and then I was able to live off $1,000 a month, right? So about $39,000 a year was what it cost for me to go to medical school. My parents, who, you know, my father's an engineer, my mom was a school teacher, were able to give me $10,000 a year. That's a lot of money, right? That was about 20% of my parents' take-home income. But they were able to give me $10,000 a year, and I borrowed $20,000 a year to go to medical school. So I came out with $80,000 of debt, which at the time I thought was enormous. But here are the data. This is from 2015. So look at this. So the median medical student owes $183,000 from medical school plus another $35,000 from undergrad. And here's a distribution. So remember, I owed 80, so I would have been in this group here, the 8% group. But look at this, 40% of medical students, right? This is recent data, owe more than $200,000 just of medical school debt. 40%. All right, so that means 40% of you all sitting in here owe more than $200,000. And so I've had medical students tell me this influences what they go into. In fact, I was talking to one of your residents today, and I asked him, he said, for sure, this influences what people go into. Now here, this is from MGMA, so this is the starting salaries for a general internist, for a hospitalist, for a dermatologist, for an anesthesiologist. But look at this, the medical subspecialties have pretty high starting salaries too. So my reason for showing this is it can't be just salaries. That's not the only reason why people aren't going into internal medicine, right? And so then comes this. So a lot of people, or a lot of residents tell me, or medical students, that they don't want to go into a subspecialty or medicine in general because they're worried about the duration of training. And the surgeons had this issue years ago too, and they were, obviously very smart with this. And so, I show this because, and this is a prime example of how a specialty is adapted to the time. So traditionally in surgery, if you wanted to be a cardiac surgeon, you had to do a full general surgery residency, which is 5 years. And in most cases, people did an additional year or two of research and then did a fellowship. So that's 8 to 10 years of postgraduate training. And the American Board of Surgery realized that over time, a lot of people were not going into surgery because of this long duration of training. And so years ago, they cut the training. They formed, I guess the term is integrated programs in cardiac surgery, vascular surgery, and I think plastic surgery. And they allowed them to do a complete training. They're not board eligible for general surgery, but they are board eligible for the subspecialty group that they're going into in an attempt to try to attract more people to go into surgery by cutting them out down the total time of training. The American Board of Internal Medicine is not caught up to this, and the duration of training is still the same. So I put interventional cardiology because that's what I am as an example. And you can see here, it could be 8 to 9 years of postgraduate training. And so a lot of people are reluctant to go into these fields because they don't want to be PGY 8 or 9. And I think that's a reasonable reason. And the question is, should medicine cut down the training or conform or develop integrated programs like surgery has? And it may be one of the things that we need to consider. But in addition to that, there are other reasons why people don't go into internal medicine. And once again, these are data. These are real data. But look at here. So this is work-life balance. So these are the percent of physicians who were polled who felt that they had enough time for their personal life outside of work. And you can see here scoring near the bottom is general internal medicine, right? At 45%, right? People feeling that they had enough time for lives outside of the hospital. Internal medicine subspecialty is even less, 43%. And then there's a term that people are using a lot now, physician burnout, right? And there's different variations of what the term burnout is, but I think all of us recognize it. We may not agree on the definition, but I think all of us agree what it is. And you look at here, internal medicine is among the highest. 52% of general internists report some type of burnout. The specialists less so, but these are all, once again, reasons why people don't go into medicine. And once again, the list is even longer, but out of interest of time, I just shared with you the themes that I hear over and over again. So the question is, what do we need to do, right? We need to make sure there's internists. We need to make sure there's subspecialists, right? We have to, perpetuate the family line, right? So what do we need to do as a Department of Medicine to ensure those things are going to happen? It's complex, right? And there's no easy solution to it. And we can spend hours sitting here talking about it, but I think the most important thing is we must recognize this. So whoever is the division or department chairs need to recognize this, and this is a serious issue, right? Because these are the people who are going to be taking care of me. They're going to be taking care of my sister, and we need to make sure we get good people in here. But if we can't get them to go into medicine right off the bat as a medical student, we're not going to get them as specialists. We have to attack these problems, and it has to be on the radar of whoever takes this position. This is a serious issue. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what the mission is. We talked about the people who should fulfill that mission, whether it be faculty members, medical students, or residents. I want to end with a very controversial topic, and that is the Department of Medicine or Department of Surgery. And I just picked on these two because these are the ones I'm most familiar with a question mark. And so, once again, these are our four founding fathers, and it was pretty simple then. There was a Department of Surgery, and that was defined as someone who does procedures. There's a Department of Medicine, defined as someone who wanders around on the wards, etc. But these definitions are more complex now. So this is a picture of a catheterization laboratory. So 15 years ago, if I asked you, who works in here and what department does he or she belong to, that would have been an easy answer, cardiology. And if it wasn't cardiology, the second answer would be interventional radiology. But these days, it's more complex. We have cardiac surgeons that are in the cath lab. We have vascular surgeons who now spend 80% of their time in a cath lab doing endovascular procedures rather than open procedures. We have neurosurgeons who now are in the cath lab. We have interventional radiology, neurointerventional radiology, and sometimes we even have cases where there's a cardiac surgeon, a cardiologist, and a vascular surgeon all in the same time doing the case on the same patient. So things have become more complex now. And so if I asked a group of medical students, I don't know if there are any medical students here, any medical students? If I asked medical students to come up with an organization scheme for all of these divisions and departments, there is no way a medical student would arrange them like they are now, right? Historically, it's been the Department of Medicine. You train as an internist, then you do subspecialty training, and therefore you are in one of these divisions within the department. Or you're a surgeon, you did general surgery, and then you did some subspecialty training, and now you're in the Department of Surgery, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way someone would organize it like this, right? Because in reality, like I just said, I have more in common, here I am, with one of the cardiac surgeons in interventional radiology and vascular surgery than I would with, say, endocrine, And so, why should it be arranged like this? And so I think part of the future of the departments of medicine and surgery will be this. And this is very controversial, right? Because it involves who's in control of whom. It involves where finances go. But in reality, it may be the more efficient way to organize a hospital, and that's by service line, right? So you have cardiovascular disease, cardiac surgery, vascular surgery, interventional radiology, cardiac imaging. You have hematology, oncology, endocrine surgery, gyn-onc, radiation oncology. And once again, these are examples, but you can see sort of the principle here. And the principle here is you organize along service lines rather than by traditional departments based on how you train, right? So very controversial because, who gets the revenue from which division or department. But once again, maybe the future of medicine is something that any department chair has to be able to realize that at some point the Department of Medicine may not be the Department of Medicine. All right, so how should we summarize this? And if you had a time machine and you could bring Osler, Halstead back to bring them to the current time. The question is, what do you think they would think about the current state of medicine? When they practice, they didn't talk about finances. They didn't talk about quality of care. It'd be interesting to see what their thoughts are on that. The next question is, if Osler was a department chair or Halstead was department chair, would he actually enjoy his job as a department chair? Because it's very different than the job that they had before. And I guess the last question is, would they be, any good at it? I guess my view is I think they would actually enjoy the job, and I think they would be very good at it. And the reason being is because I think these are smart people who are willing to adapt, and I think they would quickly realize all the issues we have today in our departments of medicine and surgery, and I think they would quickly realize that the way they practice probably not the best solution for the problems today, and they would adapt to change. So I actually think they would be good department chairs, but I think the reason why they would be good department chairs, however, is because they would realize things are different and that things need to be done differently. Whether or not they would enjoy it, I think they would. I think they would enjoy the challenge, but it is very different than things were in 1910. So thank you. Questions, comments? Dr. Browder.
That realignment that you talked about with surgical and medical, more disease-based and so forth. Most academic health centers have a hospital as part of that entity. My sense is that this realignment, and we're seeing it today in some instances, my sense is that this is hospital-driven more so than from the academic medical school departments. Is that an accurate sense, and you see that changing with time? We're almost sort of at odds with that at this point. So what's your feel about that tension that's there?
Yeah.
Where it kind of may resolve?
There's a lot of tension. The question is this realignment, I think a lot of the original drive was hospital-driven in terms of having efficient service lines, so you don't have to duplicate certain services. But I think even outside of a hospital-based practice, so for instance, let's say here, there are some advantages, right? You think from a research point of view, right? Having all those people in the same category is also quite beneficial. Also from teaching, think about how do you teach medical students, right? You don't teach them this is cardiac surgery, this is cardiology, this is cardiac imaging. When you teach them, you teach it together, right? This is cardiac pathophysiology, and the question is, should training of future residents be similar along those lines too? Once again, this is very radical. This is way out there, but I think it does have some implications in a non-hospital-based physician-type group, because I think those arguments are pertinent, and also collegiality, right? I mean, you probably as an oncologist work more with your onc-endosurgeon than you would with your cardiologist, and having in the same division or department, allowing you to align your missions and plan the future of your practice, I think also has a benefit outside of a hospital-based practice too. But you're right, it did originally start in the hospital to try to make the service lines more efficient, so you don't need multiple services, you don't need 3 ICUs, you can have 1 ICU that takes care of cardiology, cardiac surgery, and vascular surgery patients. So, but the impetus did start in the hospital. But I think it has implications and benefits outside of the hospital service line.
I think you're right. I think future reimbursement is driving us toward that model.
Yes.
Clear.
Yes. Dr. Mehta.
Follow-up question to what Dr. Brown is talking about. In several medical schools now, division of cardiology, and you mentioned one yesterday, is almost a separate entity. But then we have financial disparity. How are you gonna, in many internal medicine departments, cardiologists are the ones that financially sustain you.
Yeah.
So you take this way out of the family, the basic poor.
So so this is a great question. So when I brought this up, and I said one of the biggest barriers to this change in thinking is going to be finances. The other one has been this traditionally, I'm the chief of surgery, I'm the chief of medicine. There's no way I'm relinquishing, but finances were the big reason. And so you can imagine in a department of medicine. So in the historical model, so you have a department of medicine, you have all the specialties I listed on there, and there's some specialties that tend to be more profitable, because they do procedures or whatever. So cardiology being one of them. And so they would pay a tax to the Department of Medicine, which would allow the support of I'm going to pick on endocrine, infectious disease, et cetera. And so if they left the Department of Medicine, where do those taxes go to? And so that has been a big barrier. But if you think about it in a true group practice, right, it's the entity. So I'll give you an example like at Mayo Clinic, so even when cardiology was in the Department of Medicine, our revenue didn't go to the Department of Medicine, it went to the Mayo Clinic, which then went and got redistributed to the other divisions, departments. So if you have a true group practice of employed physicians, it really shouldn't matter, right? Because it should all go into the general pot. so to say. Now, you can say, well, yeah, it goes in the general pot, but that was part of my operating budget because we brought in said revenue, and that's a different issue, and that's more complicated because before you can say, well, that was part of our operating revenue as Department of Medicine, so when we ask for money back, we can say, but we contributed X amount. So that does make things more complicated. But I think in the future, there are more pluses than there are minuses. That is a big barrier because we're still seeing it that way. But if it's all service lines like this, including gastroenterology, hem-onc, then I think if you pair the generators with the non-generators because they're all on the same service line, that should even out. But there is an initial huge barrier, no doubt. Yeah, very controversial. That's why I saved that thing for the last. It's very controversial. Dr. Stewart.
I got an MBA a couple of years ago at the University of Phoenix.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think that was useful. Did you learn anything that you can use going forward in your career?
Yeah. So the question is getting an additional degree, and so I went into medicine. I was going to be trained as a translational scientist. That's what I was. And I was a clinician educator. But when I came out of fellowship, I started as the ICU director. And so quickly you realize that finances are a big part of medicine. You also realize that we have no education in it as physicians. Even though I consider myself financially responsible, I don't understand any of those terms. I didn't understand any of the concepts, right? And then so if you sit in a meeting and you have your, quote, medical people, and then you have your, quote, finance people, a lot of times there's a disconnect. So you speak different languages, right? No one understands what the other person is speaking. And so the goal of getting an MBA wasn't to say that I know more about finance than a finance person, or I know more about accounting than an accountant person. It was an attempt to try to learn some language so I can effectively communicate with them. And I think I was successful at that. At the time, I debated how to approach this, whether I was going to go to a traditional university-based place and take time out of my practice and go to class and get a degree, sit in a classroom like this, or do an online. And I guess, in my mind, the purpose why I was doing it was to learn the lingo. And so I thought this was the most cost-effective way for me to do it. So I did think it was advantageous because when you go to these business meetings, at least you can understand what they're saying. And if something doesn't make sense, you can ask for further clarification. Because I think it'd be more difficult for the other way around. For the business people, they're very smart, they're very good at what they're doing. But I think it'd be more difficult for them to get medical training than for us to get some business training the other way around. And I think it's important to have at least some knowledge of the concepts that are out there. Once again, you're never going to know more than they know, but I think it's important from a conceptual point of view. So I think it has helped me. If I did it in retrospect, maybe I should have taken 2 years off and done it the traditional way and gone to another institution. Because the other part of this, the part that I don't have, is the networking part, right? Where if you take 2 years off and you go to an executive MBA, and you're sitting in a classroom for 2 years with people who are executives, you get a lot of networking, which I unfortunately did not get online. But I think for my goal at the time, I think it did help.
Can you comment on Mayo Clinic's profile on funding GME? In other words, we hate to put practice money or the hard budget from the department to supplement the resident's salary. Traditionally, Medicare and through the hospital is funding but we hate to pay every year. It's not really hospital money, but hospital like is their own money. How does Mayo Clinic
Yeah.
GME dollar?
That's an important question. The question is, you all are expensive. House staff are expensive. And the question is how to pay for them. And I think Mayo has been fortunate that it's always been a very financially viable entity. And so when you have an operating margin in double digits and your absolute net operating income is in the hundreds of millions, I think that becomes less of an issue because no one would ever doubt the importance of medical education in an academic institution. And so if you have the available funds is not an argument, right? It's not an argument. But the question is important when you don't have as available funds, what to do. But that's part of the mission of an academic center. And unfortunately, sometimes the funding part is very difficult, and that's why in my one slide I said having a financially viable department is key, right? Because it allows you to do the things that you enjoy doing, and education is one of them. But to answer your question, it's very important for the Mayo Clinic, but also fortunately they've been very financially successful. So it's not. I mean, it's an important issue, but it's not a debate. Is that reasonable? Any questions? What are you guys worried about as residents? What are you worried about?
In the data you've gathered over the past few years, have you seen a shift as there's been a push in medical education for more general internists and more primary care? Have you actually seen, since they've started that push, a change in response to medical students towards the last few years, or is it still continue to be more of a road to success kind of thing?
Yeah, the question is, has there been a change over the years? And I think it depends on the institution. Medical students, some of them, like I went into medical school, I knew what I wanted to do, but I think the majority of people, and I think the majority of you didn't know what you wanted to go into. And I think having good mentors is important. And taking a medical student, so when I was in medical school, we had to go throughout the state. That was part of our responsibility of being a state-funded school. And, we were paired with practitioners which were carefully selected to make sure that they had great mentorship. And I think a lot of medical schools have figured that out. Like if you take a medical student and put him or her in just a random clinic, the majority of the time they're not going to have a positive experience in internal medicine. So I think a lot of medical schools have understood that and have handpicked clerkships to send their medical students to. And I think that has changed. And I think the trend is not as bad as it was before. So I think there has been some change, but I think that is dependent on the individual medical school. I think it's hard to say that as a generalization across the United States. So what do you guys think? You're at the forefront.
That's been my observation.
Any other concerns about the future?
There was a slide about the different costs in New York, the hospitals. So it's 2 questions. So do you think there's a good reason why the academic center was charging like almost twice as much as the non-academic center? And if there is a good reason why, how do you have any, I guess, with your experience, any ideas on how academic institutions can survive private for-profit institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the question, first of all, is why does it cost more to get taken care of at an academic medical center? And I think there's a lot of reasons, and I think it depends on the institution. I think some generalizations. I think most academic medical centers aren't as efficient, and you can define efficient however you want to, and at taking care of patients. That's one. And two, I think a lot of times, believe it or not, academic medical centers aren't as guideline-based as other institutions, because people say, well, this is the way I practice, and we're going to order this and that test. But I think the overall cost, too, for academic medical centers is higher than a regular institution, and it includes the teaching responsibilities, the faculty, and I think overall the costs are higher. The question is how to lower those costs. It's never going to be as low as a non-teaching hospital, right? Because the fact that you're a teaching hospital automatically raises some of your costs by the questions you already raised in terms of funding. So I think the solution for the future will be cost effective, so reducing the cost as low as possible, but providing also the highest quality of care, I think will be the focus of the future. But, academic medical centers inherently are less efficient. And I think, as a division section chair, we try to become as efficient as possible, even in my section now, but there's still some inefficiencies. We'll never be as streamlined as a non-teaching hospital. But that's a good question. Anything else?
Do you think pushing more for those academic centers to be more guideline-based in their treatment would, one, reduce costs, which follows from what you said, but also two, increase training as far as the efficacy of training?
I don't think so. I think, so, I forgot what I was talking about. When I was a resident, I was basically told, you can do whatever you want, right? I mean, that's, you can argue, is that good teaching? But that used to be the definition of what they thought a teaching hospital was. That as a resident, you get to do whatever you want. You take care of your patient. But I think if the future of medicine, and it's already here, I mean, I'm sure you guys probably have most experience to this. Hospitals are being graded on do they meet the quality metrics. And so when you go into practice, you're going to be rated on your quality metrics. And so if you don't learn those metrics and those habits when you're a trainee, then when are you going to learn them, right? So I think that is the part of the teaching of an academic institution now. And you can do whatever you want because you're the chief resident or you're the senior resident. That was an old model, right? That's not the current model of care. And when you go into practice, you can't practice that way. So if you're in an academic institution, that's what you have to teach, right? And so I don't know if you define that as a change or a lower quality. It's just that's the current practice, right? And you have to be teaching residents and medical students to behave in such an environment, not like the environment I was raised in, and that was, we're an academic medical center. You want an MRI because you think it could go get the MRI. I don't think that's responsible, clinically responsible for the future of medicine. So you can't be teaching that to medical students. Is that? Yeah. All right, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I mean, feel free to talk to me individually if you have any other questions or concerns. But once again, thank you for listening to my thoughts.